No, I know I'm recording now, but I'm not going to start the actual script until that feels right. Hi, everyone. My name is Asha Mahari, and this might be one of the most vulnerable things I've shared publicly. I'm making this video because I see culture shifting around power, consent, and relationships, and sharing my story feels like a way to process that shift out loud. I want to be clear, I'm coming from a spiritual, psychological, sociological, and deeply personal perspective. My goal isn't to invalidate anyone else's experience, but to offer something that might resonate. Whatever I say, again, is ultimately my truth, and I don't see it as a substitute for anyone else's. So what am I talking about? I will be sharing my experiences with sex and love addiction, polyamory, and power dynamics, and how these things intertwine for me over the course of about 10 years. The story of my relationship with my body really begins in the context of not having any strong attachments while it was developing. By the time I was 11, my family had moved many times, my biological father had signed away his rights, and my mother and adoptive father were going through a contentious divorce. I was bullied and ostracized at school, and my siblings were toddlers, so I didn't have any peers that I could confide in. My parents were understandably absorbed in their own struggles, leaving me with very little consistent emotional support. The only form of connection that I often found was sexualized attention, mostly online. I learned that my body could get and hold someone's attention the way that nothing else about me seemed to. It could bring affection, closeness, or distraction from boredom, filling a life that often felt empty or meaningless in the liminal spaces. This laid the groundwork for patterns that would later grow into a full-blown sex and love addiction once I gained more independence in my late teens. Before I go any further, I want to clarify what I mean when I talk about sex and love addiction. The term sex and love addiction describes a set of behaviors aimed at regulating anxiety or inner tension through relationships, fantasies, pornography, or physical intimacy. It's about patterns of seeking sexual or romantic input in order to feel a sense of control, connection, or stimulation. Hypersexuality is a bit different. It's usually considered a symptom rather than a standalone label. And it often shows up alongside another condition such as sexual trauma or a diagnosis such as bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, ADHD, or autism, which not everybody knows that, but yes, hypersexuality can be associated with neurodivergence. Anyway, there are cases where sex and love addiction and hypersexuality can be used interchangeably. And I tend to do that myself because both terms do capture parts of my experience. My key point is this. These terms are really misnomers. They're not about sex and they're not about love. They're about the compulsive self-regulation that can be achieved through any form of erotic tension. Some people say that addiction is a demon, and we will explore that spiritual dimension a little bit later. For now, it's important to understand how sex addiction differs from simply having a high libido. First of all, someone with a high libido could find satisfaction with one partner with a matching libido. And for them, sex can be frequent without being intrusive or fixated upon. This is because in this case, the drive is organic or otherwise rooted in the physical body. For someone with a sex addiction, though, one contained source of stimulation would never be enough. There's a need for novelty that steadily increases, the thrill of chasing a threshold that hasn't been reached yet. Each new partner, situation, or encounter feels like it might contain something the last one didn't. That's why sex addiction can exist even in someone with a lower libido. I was still engaging sexually even when my physical desire wasn't particularly high, because arousal wasn't the drive. Relief was. Over time, this pattern can create what I later recognized as desensitization. I called it numbness. I had difficulty experiencing orgasm or intimate pleasure at all without any highly stimulating context. At the time, I didn't understand it. Doctors could find nothing physically wrong, and the problem would kind of come and go. But I know that many people that are addicted to sex, they create a narrative around this. They tell themselves that they're just the kind of person that needs more intensity, more variety, without realizing that there's a void restricting the depth of pleasure that they're getting out of these encounters, and that's that that's why. Hypersexuality can sometimes be understood as the expression of validation seeking, and I want to affirm this under my own understanding of validation. Validation is a bridge between two inner narratives, one telling you you're okay and one telling you that you're not. Positive validation reinforces the part of you that knows you're okay. Negative validation reinforces the part of you that believes it's not. This is the hungry ghost metaphor. It's the kind of affirmation that leaves no resolution and does not stop wanting for a new fix. So by now it might be clear why I was attracted to multi-partnership during my hypersexual period. I explored this in several ways. When I was single, I was often involved with more than one person at a time. I was the third partner to a couple in a dynamic that lasted for about 5 years. I dated a married man who identified as poly for about a year, and I participated in several threesome one-night stands. Even when in what you might call committed relationships with men, I would remain casually erotic with women. I would often sexualize my friendships if I could, and looking back, I see that this was because showing up platonically felt too raw. I was grounding myself in my social life, using the only form of connection that I felt comfortable with. What I liked about dating couples was that I could regulate twice as quickly, getting twice the attention, twice the validation, twice the sense of taboo, and as someone bisexual, the best of both worlds. I was aware of the power imbalances, but at the time, I just thought it was hot. And that might still be true for anyone watching this, even as I am about to unpack these dynamics more deeply. Most of these experiences, they were fun and the couples were all really cool, but underneath there was also a subtle dance playing out with these mechanics, often left unspoken. So for this next section, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about those mechanics. To preface, I'm not here to shame or blame any group of individuals. I'm intentionally looking at polyamory from a systemic perspective, particularly when it operates through hierarchy. For the sake of clarity, when I refer to polyamory, I am also including ENM, or ethical non-monogamy. Some people make a distinction between the two, but I'm not going to for this conversation because the dynamics that I'm describing can show up regardless. That said, there are also cases where the term ENM functions more as a gloss than a practice, where the language of ethics is present, but the integrity isn't actually embedded in the structure itself. Ethics can't only be named. They have to be lived, and they have to be supported by the framework they're operating within. So what is hierarchical polyamory? It's an open relationship between two people who remain each other's primary point of attachment and meet each other's primary needs. The main factors of life building happen within the primary couple. Priority of time, attention, and support goes to that primary relationship. Meanwhile, additional partners are brought into the system and serve some function in relation to the primary partnership, sometimes explicitly acknowledged and sometimes not. That function tends to necessitate a form of objectification, not necessarily in the sense that anyone is being treated like an object, but in the sense that they're being reduced to a role defined by what the system requires. From my experience and observation, when conflict arises with non-primary partners, the core issue is usually a need that can't be fully met within the limits of their role. The roles that I'm referring to can be sexual or non-sexual. Either way, the non-primary partner often becomes a surrogate for something unresolved in the primary relationship. This could be sexual anxieties, unexpressed tension, unreconciled incompatibilities, or they may serve as a symbol of rebellion, of freedom, desirability, or even spiritual enlightenment, particularly in some New Age circles. People can consent to these roles, and that, yes, can be emphatic, but consent alone doesn't dissolve structural dynamics. In some cases, it actually obscures them, shifting responsibility onto the individual navigating the system rather than onto the system itself. This is especially true when the yes is coming from an unhealed or dysregulated place. I was aware of many of these hidden dynamics while I was participating in them. A part of me felt validated by the objectification itself. I felt useful. It gave a sense of purpose to the patterns that I was already playing out. For example, I was comfortable with what can be called the one-man policy. It has a more explicit name, but we'll go with that for the sake of this video. And this is where there's a male-female couple, and they allow female partners but restrict male partners. Frequently, what this reflects is a cultural or subconscious belief that women are more objectifiable while men are not. I recognize the power imbalance, but at the time it felt exciting rather than complex. Uh-oh. Why? Oh, you're starting to overheat. Okay, let's pause. So that said, I want to zoom out even further and talk about the gendered realities of non-monogamy. Primary couples already create a 2-against-1 power dynamic when they invite others into the relationship. That part I feel like is discussed more often. What's talked about less often is the additional layer that gender introduces. Men, on average, hold greater physical strength and more weaponizable social power than women. When you add factors like authority, charisma, or spiritual ideology, those scales can become even more precarious. I'm not saying that women are always harmed in these dynamics. I'm saying that there are multiple structural conditions under which women are more likely to be harmed. And those risks compound as more partners enter the system. And this is where the nervous system matters. For most of human history, women's bodies have carried physical vulnerability, pregnancy, and the bulk of early caregiving. Male presence and protection didn't just mitigate emotional pain. It was often directly tied to survival. Divided male attention registered as a real risk. Culture evolves faster than biology, but our bodies still respond to cues of relational safety or its absence. So when it comes to non-monogamy, many women feel something visceral. I'm not a biological essentialist, and I'm not saying that all women respond in the same way. I'm saying that when emotions like jealousy are present, they're often the nervous system reacting to a perceived loss of attachment or survival threat. This is where I take issue with biological arguments that claim that we're all wired to be polyamorous. The implicit message is that polyamory should be the natural or evolved choice for everyone. When I was disconnected from my own body truth, those ideas actually gave me permission to stay disconnected. When intellectual authority is used to override somebody's boundaries, that's not science, that's propaganda. There's another reason these arguments don't quite sit right with me. They're often based in reproductive logic, which would invalidate the function of polyamory in queer relationships. It's actually the same framework that's historically been used to invalidate queer people altogether. Human sexuality has already shown itself to be far more complex than biological functions. So I've come to a place where I'm wary of nature being treated as a moral authority for how people should bond. I believe that our relationship to our own bodies is where authority actually lives. That's what I call sovereignty. And to bring it back to gender one more time, it's women who have historically been conditioned to doubt their bodily signals and to have their sexuality governed by something outside of them. Polyamory does not exist outside of patriarchy. In certain contexts, the two can actually reinforce one another, particularly when access to women's bodies is glorified without equal regard for women's vulnerabilities. I don't believe that we are wired to be polyamorous. I do believe that we are wired to seek safety in relationships. Whether someone chooses monogamy or polyamory, that choice usually reflects where some part of them feels safest. And wherever one person's safety consistently outweighs another's, that's where you'll find a power imbalance. Within hierarchical polyamory, a love relationship has already been established and is being prioritized, which means that secondary partnerships, often explicitly or not, operate on behalf of something else. And whatever that something is, reveals the energetic transaction, but rarely the energetic cost. When I was around 30, I started to feel drained and disinterested by my intimate encounters. After exhausting multiplicity, variety, and intensity, I gave up on those outward dimensions of my sexual exploration and went inwards with some harder questions. The first were, what does someone have left to give when they're already prioritizing another relationship? And why does that feel like a fair exchange for my body? My relationship to my body had been entirely utilitarian, and this showed up in how I dated more broadly. In the US, we call it casual dating when you're talking to someone, maybe sleeping with them, but without exclusivity. I conceded to the language of not looking for anything serious and let's see where this goes. And in doing so, I lowered my level of maintenance while leaving what I felt like was my most valuable currency on the table. I made myself convenient, and as such, I became a match for people seeking convenience. Not all of them, but enough to mirror the degree to which I didn't know my own worth. That coping mechanism was rooted in what I now recognize as internalized voyeurism, the way of relating that kept me desirable but not fully present. It allowed me to feel adapted to a world that seemed to reward access over depth. There was a paradox at play. Romantic attachment was the only form of attachment I felt I could confidently maintain, so I pursued it for connection. But intimacy was also the place where I disassociated the most. I understand now that this disassociation was the cause of my loss of pleasure. The symptom was numbness. The function was protection. I wanted proximity to intimacy, but also power over it. True intimacy would have required being seen in ways I didn't yet feel worthy of. So each connection felt emotionally safer as long as it remained surface level, while also being deeply unsatisfying. Around this time, I was working with parts work, which if you don't know, is a very somatic way of meeting yourself. One night, I had a conversation with my yoni, and she told me that she didn't want to be entered without love anymore. And so I agreed, and I made a defined relationship to be an added determinant for that. What I didn't anticipate was that this would lead to nearly 2 years of celibacy. I had built my life around sexual collateral. When that was removed, the structure collapsed. I lost friends. I stopped drinking and partying too, which contributed to that. But all in all, I lost my social anchor and had fewer reasons to leave the house, period. What I gained was time, quiet, neutral, alone time. Not just being alone, but being alone without energetic noise. Enough space for reflection to arise on its own. What I experienced was that when you're celibate, any part of your ego that's attached to sex begins to dissolve. By the way, the ego is a construct of your beliefs. So say the belief is, I'm only free if I'm sexually available. During celibacy, a belief like that stops getting lived reinforcement. Without that negative validation, it transmutes, along with any shadows, or what we might call demons, that resonated there. What's left is the realization that freedom was never conditional to begin with. Much of what we call freedom in our sexuality and relationships has been shaped by systems that benefit from us constantly chasing more, especially when that more lives outside of us. What I've come to understand is that what we're actually chasing is love, and that love is far more abundant when it's self-sourced. Within systems of hierarchy, love may exist, but often conditionally. Conditional upon providing a service while not disrupting the structure that stands. Oof, you gotta pause there. I'm considering whether consent alone is sufficient in any system that it's built on extraction, without wondering why someone would consent to their own reduction in the first place. I know why I did. For me, multi-partnership, by which I mean casual dating, non-exclusive connections, and polyamory, was beautiful in some ways, but it also maintained an environment around my patterns that made them impossible to change. I believe we're in a collective awakening, not to ascend into some new territory, but to descend more deeply into ourselves than we ever have. When I hear New Earth, this is what I interpret that means. The New Earth is humanity returning to its original frequency of self-love. If any of this resonated, I invite you to explore more with me on self-love, sacred sexuality, and body sovereignty across my other platforms. And if you're a woman who's struggled with sexual dysfunction, I'll be speaking more about that in some format. I'm Asha Mahari on Facebook. AshaMahari.com is my website. And for everyone else, I leave this here.